This panel is entitled, it's a mouthful, Expansion of the TRIPS Waiver, Parallel Importation, Anti-Diversion Provisions, and the Potential Effect of the Waiver on Markets for COVID-Related Pharmaceuticals. In short, our panel's about the TRIPS Waiver. And I expect that 90% of you know what that is, but I'll do a little bit of table setting here before I introduce our panel and hand it over to them. So the TRIPS waiver was a proposal in October 2020 by India and South Africa when they petitioned the World Trade Organization proposing that intellectual property obligations under the treaty, the key treaty that deals with IP at the World Trade Organization, the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property, they asked for a waiver of their obligations under that treaty. Now, what that means is that treaty obligates them to maintain certain standards with respect to intellectual property rights, to enforce intellectual property rights, to make them available to both their own nationals as well as foreign nationals. So what they were asking for is an opportunity for countries to choose to waive these, to choose to act in what would otherwise be against these treaty obligations in order to, for example, allow companies and allow actors within their borders to duplicate technology and vaccines related to COVID, to fighting COVID, and otherwise not have to comply with the many obligations under TRIPS, including the opportunities to impose compulsory licenses, which are subject to a particular process. So there was extensive debate and discussion about whether this waiver should be adopted throughout early 2021. And then what was considered, I think, a surprise move, the Biden administration in May 2021 endorsed the waiver. There was another year of further discussion, and a version of the waiver was adopted in June 2022. Now, the waiver at that point specifically applied to vaccines, but there was a provision that for discussion as to whether the waiver should be extended to therapeutics. That decision was supposed to be taken by the end of 2022, but the period of consideration was extended in part so that the U.S. could further consider the decision. The U.S. government asked the International Trade Commission to prepare a report on the issue. They were supposed to deliver the report by Tuesday next week. So that report will be delivered to the U.S. Trade Representative by the ITC on Tuesday next week. So this is a very timely panel because we are likely then to see much discussion of the extension of the waiver to therapeutics over the next few months with a decision in February in Geneva. Just a few more words here about the difference between vaccines and therapeutics, not on a deep technical level, but just pointing out that the waiver regarding vaccines was, of course, targeted to COVID-19 vaccines. And although in some respects that was not a completely narrow waiver because COVID-19 vaccines, at least the most successful COVID-19 vaccines, were based on new and innovative technology. Many of the vaccines we grew up with were made using technology that was well known, manufactured using technology that was well known, and the innovation came in finding that specific way to combat the particular pathogen. With the mRNA vaccines and even the viral vector vaccines that were used to fight COVID, the technology platforms were new and innovative, and the manufacturing processes have had to be stood up, and they were also new and innovative. So you had innovation from beginning to end, and often it has been backed by very recent venture capital investment and other private investments of billions of dollars. But nonetheless, in some respects, the initial waiver was targeted to COVID-19 vaccines. Therapeutics, by contrast, are anything that could potentially alleviate your symptoms or battle the virus. And in fact, the kind of therapeutics we've seen have been drugs sometimes that are of general application, like remdesivir, early on in the pandemic, and more recently, things like Paxlovid, that are combinations or individual treatments that existed before that were more broadly used against to battle other kinds of viruses and disease conditions. And so that is what the decision is being taken on right now, is whether that waiver of obligations under TRIPS, will be extended to allow countries to permit permit within their borders people to make, use, and sell therapeutics that without regard to the intellectual property rights of the innovators. So with that, we have a panel joining us today that is quite qualified to discuss the topic, and I'm looking forward to working with all of them. Unfortunately, Dr. Copen could not join us, but we have Ernest Kawka, who is Deputy Vice President of the trade association PhRMA, Dr. Christine McDaniel, who among other things is a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center here at George Mason University, and Eric Solovy, Vice President and Legal Counsel of Qualcomm. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to each of our panelists to make an opening statement describing their understanding of the waiver and the issues with it. And after that, we have some follow-up questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So with that, I hand it over to Ernest. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark, and thank you all. In preparing for today's conference and this panel specifically, I think I want to kind of characterize my comments in three buckets. So before diving into kind of the meats and bounds of what is the TRIPS waiver, what's the status, and what's next, to kind of provide a foundational context of how this debate unfolded, going back kind of to Mark's earlier chronology, back to 2020. And I hope that some of those comments could serve as almost a cautionary tale of, despite the fact that the focus is on COVID technologies, the pressure internationally, I think, is mounting on a global erosion of intellectual property, not only patents, but the entire framework, whether under TRIPS and under international, but also national laws. So first, I'll go into some of that, contextualizing how the debate happened and what industry's actions were in order to frankly, combat the global pandemic. Second, then I'll take some time to reflect on what happened in terms of the waiver itself, going back to the decision, as Mark mentioned, in June of last year on the vaccines waiver, and then kind of leave it at what is the current status and next steps. And it's very timely, as was mentioned. Next Tuesday, the US ITC will be delivering its investigational kind of findings on the supply, the demand, and access of these technologies globally, specifically treatments and diagnostics. So maybe diving into some of this context. The effort required to mount this global pandemic response required, and ultimately its success required research development to produce safe and effective COVID vaccines and treatments. I think overall that story is extremely underestimated and underappreciated. Since the earliest reports of the novel coronavirus, researchers from around the world, governments likewise, scrambled to not only identify but then characterize that virus. This is the December 2019 into January 2020 timeframe. Soon after that, in that early January timeframe, that global effort delivered not only identifying the virus, but likewise, almost simultaneously, a full genomic sequence of the new virus was published. This was by cross kind of national teams. This is in early January timeframe. I think the first sequence was published on January 11th. So that's my, I guess, first flashpoint, that January 2020 timeframe, sequence available. From that day forward, I think it's fair to characterize that the race was on globally to create safe and effective countermeasures, whether that's vaccines or treatments. And that race was truly a global collaboration. Researchers from academia, industry, non-governmental organizations, governments, and others worked all hand in glove to counter this singular and global threat. Fast forward not more than 10, 11 months, now we're in the December 2020 time period, the first COVID vaccine received emergency use authorization in the United States. That first vaccine was based on a novel mRNA platform, as Mark mentioned, that was decades in the making. This was not a kind of flip the switch, create a vaccine. This was the efforts of foundational intellectual property frameworks and research that enabled to deliver that technology. And that same technology, as we all recently learned, was awarded the Nobel Prize in medicine. And to be clear, the innovation response in 2020, again, was grounded in years of existing research, all underpinned by strong IP that now the waiver is threatening. And in that context, I think it's fair to say it's no surprise that most or the majority of COVID vaccines and treatments were developed by American and European entities. These are environments where IP is robust and strong. And for context, under normal circumstances, and I mentioned January 2020 to December, merely 11 months, under normal circumstances, it takes an average of over a decade to research and develop a new therapeutic, a treatment, or a vaccine. To say that this was unprecedented, I think, is an understatement. One of the concurrent challenges was to scale that production of the vaccine. Never, I think, before, not only were industry and researchers tasked with creating the countermeasure, but also scaling it up to a global population immediately. And that effort, again, was underpinned by collaboration across different stakeholders across the globe. Through partnerships, by the end of 2021 into the early kind of months of 22, over 20 companies worldwide were manufacturing enough doses to supply COVID-19 vaccines to the entire global population. Today, over 15 billion doses have been produced and delivered around the world, and this accounts for more than 70% of the global population receiving at least one dose. This effort was estimated or is estimated to have saved over 20 million lives and avoided over 80 million hospitalizations. That's on the vaccine side. Experience relating to COVID treatments is very similar. Concerning treatments alone, existing IP frameworks enabled more than 140 manufacturing partnerships spanning more than 30 countries. This includes countries from Brazil, India, Indonesia, Singapore, South Africa. I'm underscoring the diversity of these economies where these manufacturing partnerships happened. That effort yielded over 70 million courses of antiviral treatments to be produced by the end of 2022. This far exceeded demand, which was about 19 million, and existing stockpiles, which are around 30 million, are large enough to account for expected total demand worldwide. Industry, the pharmaceutical industry partnered with various organizations, whether governments, multilateral organizations, to provide access pathways for all of these innovations in all, around the globe. As a result, more than 130 countries are eligible to receive these treatments at no cost. Unfortunately, I think it's worth underscoring here, few countries have placed orders or procured through these channels, and others yet remain to authorize even the existing treatments for the markets. Just to underscore, only 5, as of middle of this year, only 5 African countries have authorized the use of a treatment. So I guess maybe reflecting a little bit on the waiver debate, I think it's fair to characterize that, in short, supply, cost, nor IP inhibited access to COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. Yet we have a handful of WTO members, namely the proponents, continuing to seek an expansion of the June 2022 vaccines waiver for now to cover treatments and diagnostics. Ever since the original proposal by India and South Africa, the TRIPS waiver debate, I think, has been guided by long-standing industrial policy and not by evidence. Unfortunately, come last year, the U.S. government's support of the waiver, not only the waiver negotiation, but ultimately the ministerial decision on vaccines, has further emboldened economies and multilateral organizations to seek eroding foundational IP frameworks at international and national levels. So, for instance, the UN Secretary General just last year called for expanding or considering IP waivers on green technology at a country level. Brazil, emboldened by the decision or the conversation at that time at the WTO, proposed to expand its compulsory licensing law to include forced trade secret disclosure. How that mechanism would work in practice would be unclear. Other countries like the European Union are currently, right now, considering expanding their compulsory licensing mechanisms to create a pan-European compulsory license system. Compare that with that CL mechanisms are grounded at a national level. In terms of what's next, and I'll pass it to Christine, I'm hopeful that the pending decision on whether to expand the TRIPS waiver will eventually be driven by evidence. As you all know, the US ITC is tasked to deliver its findings to USTR next week. And of the nearly 200 stakeholders that participated in that investigation throughout this year, the vast majority of input provided was overwhelmingly underscoring the critical role not only of how IP delivered in this response, but likewise the damage that an expansion would have on innovation for COVID and frankly other technologies. Ultimately, the WTO will decide on whether to expand the waiver during or by the February 2024 ministerial, and hopefully this time the U.S. government will take into account this evidence to not only showcase that a waiver is unnecessary, but would create lasting damage to not only the TRIPS framework, but international IP. So I'll stop there and perhaps pass the baton.
Thank you, Ernest, and thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone, for coming out on a late Thursday afternoon. So I'm an economist. I'm not a lawyer, but IP is my true love, and have seen this up close and from afar, from U.S. lens and other countries' lenses. So it was really exciting to be able to talk about this today with you all. So I am at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I'm a senior research fellow there. But today I'm going to talk about some of the economic issues surrounding a TRIPS waiver, but you can't really help from stepping into the legal framework of this a bit. I have worked with a lot of lawyers, and so there are some legal relevant arguments here, but most of my remarks will be on the econ side. So 2 big points, and so one is point number 1 is that the case of harm due to TRIPS IP protections for COVID-19 medicines, therapeutics, diagnostics has not been proven. Right? So if you look and go into the line-by-line details of what needs to happen for waivers to occur, there has to be a case made that harm has come about because of the IP protections. And I don't see harm I don't see any evidence of harm from these particular IP protections. That's point number one. And just to be clear, what we're talking about, when you're talking about a waiver, you're talking about the government taking away private property from a private citizen. This is property that a private citizen has worked to obtain, right? And that is what a waiver is. You know, when I hear people talking about waivers, it's very, sort of flippant, right? But what it is really, it is the government taking away private property. So keep that in mind and whenever you hear about people talking about a waiver, that's exactly what it is. And that private property is valuable. It has value in the financial markets. We see it every day in the financial markets. Companies, large and small, especially smaller ones, use their IP portfolios as assets to leverage against, to get loans and to grow. I mean, that's how Marvel became what it is today, right? They leveraged their copyright portfolio. And so a waiver is the government taking away private property, okay? So anyway, again, point one, I do not see evidence of harm, economic harm from these TRIPS IP protections. Point number two, actually, there is substantial evidence that a TRIPS waiver for COVID-19 medicines, therapeutics, diagnostics would impose harm. So, well, first of all, the direct effect, again, this is, you are taking away private property, you're taking away private property from a citizen, and so that's direct harm, right? You're devaluing their asset portfolio. But also, in terms of the dynamic analysis, life is a repeated game, right? And so exactly what Ernest was saying, these decades of work and innovation, financial decisions, R&D, and expenditure decisions that went in to developing the framework that led to the mRNA vaccine, all those decisions were made based on the IP framework in the US, EU, and around the world in those particular countries. When the waiver weakens that, and it will forever alter those decision makings moving forward. All right, so life is a repeated game. You take, with the waiver, that will inevitably change firms' decisions on R&D investment moving forward. So the next time, the next pandemic comes around, we may not be as prepared as we were this time, right? And it won't happen overnight, but it's like death by 1,000 cuts. And these waivers will chip away at the incentives to innovate. Another thing I want to talk about is, about the some of the reasons that went behind the around the sickness and deaths, that would have occurred had the mRNA vaccine had not been there. But then also, and this also gets to what Ernest was saying, in terms of the countries around the world where you don't see a very high vaccination rate. I was actually just looking at this last week. But, and then I was also looking at, World Bank figures on how many vaccines that they have financed, and then how many vaccines have actually been fully, implemented. And it's not even, and anyway, there's a huge gap between the number of vaccines that the World Bank has bought and the number of vaccines that have been put into people's arms. And if you can then look at this data country by country, and you see, not surprisingly, and it's quite unfortunate, but the countries with low vaccination rates, it's not because of lack of access. It's because it varies by country, but it's either poor logistics, poor governance, fear of vaccines, misinformation, the list goes on and on. But it's not because they couldn't access the vaccine or therapeutics or diagnostics themselves. All right, so, yeah. So, given that, point one, that there is no evidence to suggest that the IP protections have been harmful, and point two, that actually there is evidence to suggest that taking away the IP protections would be harmful, then, as Alden Abbott and I conclude in our public interest submission to that ITC study that Ernest mentioned that will be released next week, we're excited about that, then we would conclude that there is no need for a waiver of such protections. And unless those 2 points can be made and proven, then you, according to the actual WTO language itself, you cannot make a case for the waiver. So it's, just simply going back to the language that all 164 WTO members agreed to, there is no sound, reasonable case for the waiver, we argue. And this is our public interest comment here. It's online. It's publicly available. And then I would just mention that it is for it's hard to ignore, but you have for the Biden administration on one hand to continue, for instance, with complaining about other countries stealing IP protections, continuing with taxing imports from China under Section 301 that go directly back to allegations of, and legitimate evidence, one could argue, on IP theft, theft of U.S. Of intellectual property rights. But then on the other hand, say, well, but we're going to say that governments can take away your IP. So first of all, we're going to tax U.S. consumers because we don't want China stealing your IP. But on the other hand, we are going to take away this IP from these guys over here. I mean, it's clearly conflicting goals. And it's kind of rich for the U.S. to have been the one to come out in support of the waiver, given years and years, decades and decades of very strong statements, and consistently strong out of the U.S. on the importance of intellectual property right protections. I'll leave it there for my dear friend, Eric Solovy. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks so much, Christine. Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the George Mason Center for hosting us and this particular topic. Prior to joining Qualcomm, I spent about 20 years litigating WTO disputes and writing about the WTO and the WTO TRIPS agreement, so I've thought quite a bit about these issues over the years. So what I want to talk about today is sort of expand a little bit beyond what we've already heard from our fantastic other panelists, and talk about the impact of the TRIPS waiver and related discussions beyond the pharmaceutical industry, beyond the particular context of COVID-19 and medicines. While the focus of the current discussions on the TRIPS waiver, of course, because we call it the TRIPS waiver, is COVID-19 and vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. These types of high-profile discussions among the WTO members can potentially reverberate to other industries. We're talking about IP generally. When you go after an important industry, you go after all industries in all forms of IP in the entire ecosystem. So that's what I want to talk about today. So for countries that are expressing support for the TRIPS waiver or the TRIPS waiver extension, particularly in view of the facts that we've just heard from Ernest and Christine, the signal is a willingness to weaken IP protection, to find a reason to weaken IP protection overall. For the United States, of course, weak IP protection is inconsistent with U.S. national and strategic interests and leadership. It is IP, of course, which incentivizes the R&D and private investment that allows U.S. companies to be leaders in technology of all kinds, allows the U.S. industry overall in the U.S. to be a leader in innovation of all kinds. Also, one of the issues beyond incentives for innovation that I think doesn't get discussed enough is the idea that weak intellectual property protection makes it very difficult for companies, universities, and other innovators to collaborate with each other. And this, the ability of strong IP to allow companies, including across borders, to collaborate, to share research, to share technology, including trade secrets, is a critically important aspect of global IP protection. In an article that I published in the Northwestern International Law and Business Journal in the winter of 2022, the Doha Declaration at 20, I talk about in detail the Pfizer-BioNTech relationship and how these two companies were able to collaborate across borders with the help of strong IP protection. Looking back at what WTO members used to say about the importance of IP, and looking at the negotiating history, for example, of the TRIPS agreement, one of the things I point out in this article was back in 1989 when Article 39 of the TRIPS agreement was being negotiated. Article 39 of the TRIPS agreement requires countries to protect undisclosed information, including trade secrets and test data that's submitted for regulatory approval. The U.S. representative to those negotiations explained that trade secret protection is, and I'm quoting, important for developing countries since there is no better way of encouraging the transfer of technology to developing countries than to provide protection to trade secrets and proprietary information which constituted the very essence of transfer of technology. So this is talking about how can we get technology from developed countries to developing countries, and the U.S. government explained it's intellectual property, that's what we need. Very different dialogue right now. Similarly, in June 2002, in a communication to the WTO, the European Union explained, and I'm quoting, "The existence and enforcement of an IPR system in the recipient country is often a prerequisite, and the confidence of the right owners in that system is a key element," end quote, of an IP right holder's decision to license its technology. So the very same theme. It's about cross-border voluntary licensing being dependent on strong IP protection. So, as I have so much experience interpreting WTO law, litigating WTO cases, I always like to start an analysis with the legal text itself and also look back at the negotiating history of a legal text. So we've been talking about the TRIPS waiver, excuse me, as it was agreed to at the WTO. But I think when we're looking at the extension, the proposals to extend the TRIPS waiver, it's important to look back at some of the early proposals for the initial proposals for the TRIPS waiver and how broad it was, and what that means for technologies going beyond the pharmaceutical industry and IP rights going beyond patents. So I'm looking at the draft decision text from May 25th, 2021. This was the proposal by India, South Africa, a number of other countries, Egypt, Bolivia, Venezuela, Bolivia, and others. And the core of their proposal was as follows. I'm going to read it, and then I'll go through it more closely. The obligations of members to implement or apply sections 1, 4, 5, and 7 of Part 2 of the TRIPS agreement, or to enforce these sections under Part 3 of the TRIPS agreement, shall be waived in relation to health products and technologies, including diagnostics, therapeutics, so this is coming back now, right? Vaccines, that's what's already been done. Medical devices, personal protective equipment, their materials or components, and their methods and means of manufacture for the prevention, treatment, or containment of COVID-19. So let's just break that down a little bit. And sections 1, 4, 5, and 7 of Part 2. So what does that cover? Part 2 is where you find the substantive provisions, the protection that must be provided by all the WTO members. Section 1 is copyright. The entire copyright section of the TRIPS agreement was proposed to be waived. Section 4, industrial design. Section 5, patent. Section 7, trade secrets and data protection. So quite a broad scope of IP protection. The only major type of protection that wasn't included there is trademarks, because evidently the proponents could not come up with the rationale as to why trademarks should be compulsory license. So it's extraordinary. And things to think about trade secrets, for example. The idea of waiving protection on trade secrets, which was the topic of another article that I published. How do you do that? How do you compulsory license or fail to protect a trade secret? Trade secrets are often protected by, agreements that employees sign when they when they work for a company, and if they reveal that trade secret to the public, they violated their employment contract. So how do you waive that? Very interesting question, not very well thought through. The entire enforcement section of the TRIPS agreement, Part 3 of the TRIPS agreement, was to be waived. If you have no ability to enforce IP rights in court, then you have the IP right loses much, if not all, of its value. The language then says shall be waived in relation to. So what does that mean? In relation to health products and technologies. Very, very broad, in relation to. Why not just say health products and technologies? And then we have the list of diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, medical devices, et cetera. Particularly concerning then is the materials or components of all of these things. So what does it mean to waive IP on the components on all components of medical devices in relation to treating, diagnosing COVID-19? What are those medical devices, for example? X-ray machines, thermometers, sophisticated diagnostics, any of those things. What are the components? It's the entire supply chain, basically, that could be up for grabs with language like this. So I think this is looking back at sort of the history of how this evolved and looking at the idea of expanding now. I think it's very revealing to see where the proponents actually want this to go eventually, and it's quite broad and it's quite encompassing many industries beyond the pharmaceutical industry. So one more point about the existing TRIPS waiver, which from June 2022, which is the basis for, my understanding is they would probably use very similar text and amend it to cover therapeutics and diagnostics, although it's not exactly clear how that will play out. But one of the aspects of the current waiver, which I am critical of in this Doha Declaration of 20 article, is the idea that the tracking and tracing, when you have we have Article 31 bis of the TRIPS agreement, which allows an exception to the compulsory license restrictions, allows under certain circumstances for countries to produce under compulsory license for export, okay? And as part of that deal, which arose from the Doha Declaration, there were very carefully negotiated rules on how you would track and trace those medicines produced under compulsory license to make sure they go to the right place. So one of the things that the TRIPS waiver, the existing TRIPS waiver does, is it relaxes those requirements. It uses very murky language, like governments must use reasonable efforts without going into the specifics. When explaining the importance of these tracking and tracing provisions, back in August 2003, the decision implementing paragraph 6 of the Doha Declaration, in the general counsel chairperson's statement said, and I quote, "Members recognize that the purpose of the decision would be defeated if products supplied under this decision are diverted from the markets for which they are intended." So the very purpose of that decision would be undermined by relaxing these tracing and tracking requirements, and that's exactly what was done in the TRIPS waiver. So it's a very dangerous point. Finally, I think this has been said many times, but I think I just want to conclude with this point. Without strong IP protection and the incentives that it generates, there would be no advanced technology available to compulsory license. So the idea that the short-term idea of compulsory licensing ignores the many years, I think, that Ernest did a great job of covering, the many years of research and the incentives and risks that go into creating that technology. And again, this goes well beyond the pharmaceutical industry. Thanks so much.
Thanks. So we're going to do, I'm going to pose some questions to our panelists. And first I want to talk about consequences, because what Eric said, the last thing he said about the importance of incentives for innovative activity is well accepted. But the one question is just what are some of the specific impacts of the waiver, right? When people were arguing against the waiver originally, we talked about the importance of incentives. Well, the waiver happened. And as it was being discussed, I was doing a report where I was able to talk to many people in the life sciences industry, many people who were working on manufacturing COVID-19 vaccines, other experts who worked for companies. And one interesting thing they said was, if there were a future pandemic, we can't imagine not responding to it somehow. It's just what we do, which in some ways is reassuring. But they said, but we couldn't, if with a waiver with less effective IP rights, we couldn't do it the same way. We probably wouldn't be as fast, we wouldn't be as effective, we wouldn't cooperate as much with others. So I want to focus in on these kinds of consequences and consider that commenting, I'm going to ask the panelists to comment on how the pandemic might affect innovators' responses, affect and shape innovators' responses to a future pandemic, and or the impact it might have on cooperation, and or its impact with respect to the international IP system generally. So with that, I'll hand it off to Ernest first.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. There's a certain, I think, irony in the vaccines waiver, in the sense that to date, not a single WTO member has availed itself of the waiver from last year. In terms of consequences, I think there are, I don't know, I probably imagine them along two lines, right? One, acute for the innovator. I think it will make decisions on how partnerships are entered, how licensing is done with partners around the world. I think that will be reimagined, right? And to your point, in times of a global, crisis, whether it's a pandemic or otherwise, I think the goal here is to go as fast as possible and to throw innovation at solving these problems quickly. So I do think that one immediate consequence that history will kind of write here is gumming up that response rate, right? Of course, I think there is another bucket of consequences, and that's more systemic, right? And we're already, and I kind of alluded a little bit to this in some of my remarks, even before the waiver decision was made last year for vaccines, there were economies just chomping at the bit nationally to start amending their domestic IP laws in line with what Eric just went through, the original waiver proposal, right? And I mentioned Brazil, for example, on attempting to stand up a regime where there would be a compulsory licensing mechanism for trade secrets. What that would look like or how that would operate, unclear. But as we all know, a trade secret disclosed in Brazil is a trade secret quashed across the globe. Brazil was not alone in that. A number of economies in Southeast Asia were very quick to follow. And then outside of the national context, this is just, I think it's fair to characterize that on one hand, it was no surprise that the proponents of the original waiver brought this to the WTO. These are long-standing countries that have opposed the IP framework and have been doing everything for decades now at the WTO and the Geneva institutions generally to erode that IP framework. And I think it was a perfect kind of opportunity to advance that proposal, right? And regardless of what happens, I think in February with the ministerial on whether or not to expand the waiver to treatments and diagnostics, this conversation's not over. I think there will be other and different iterations of how this coordinated and I think frankly well kind of thought out attack on IP, whether in Geneva or in various regions and countries. We're going to see this spill into other areas, other technologies. We're already seeing that groundwork, as I mentioned, at the UN on green tech. We're already seeing that groundwork being laid at the WTO with ag, food security, and other areas here. So I think again, to summarize, consequences really prolonging those decisions to act fast, and then ones that are more systemic. And I think those are the more I think long-lasting negative consequences of this TRIPS debate.
Christine?
Yeah, it's interesting seeing the countries that are that want to do this, and I think the big picture, like if what you want to do is just redistribute wealth, right, from say north to south, if you will, there are better ways to do it that wouldn't necessarily, change our entire innovation system, right? So, there's a big difference between just redistributing wealth, a one-off thing, and then changing institutional structures, which will have long-lasting effects on innovation decisions and investment decisions, right? So we know that incumbents tend to prefer weak IP regimes, right? But actually, and John Barnett describes this really well in his great book recently on innovation. But where he went through dozens and dozens and dozens of innovation events in the United States, and showing that that patents, copyrights and trademarks, but especially patents, were the core of the success for the small guy, right? It's the small firms, the entrepreneurs. They're the ones that heavily disproportionately rely on private intellectual property rights. And without that, you overpower, you might say, the incumbent. and you make it easier for them to squash the disruptors, right? So this is a very, I mean, we are really treading on, this is a slippery slope here because, if you want to change that whole system, I mean, you're looking at, down the road of changing the entire way we think about markets. And then also, and about barriers to entry or lack or ability to enter a market. And then it also, we have to do some hard thinking about how it would affect investment decisions, right? So you're sitting there, whether you're a small innovator, medium-sized, or a large innovator, and if there's an X% chance, non-zero, and that X% is definitely greater than it was, now, than it was before the waiver discussions from COVID, and that X might be increasing, what is that threshold where it really will affect how you change your investment decisions? And then if it gets high enough, then will you only invest in something if the government, agrees before the fact to share some risk with you, right? Well, now you're asking the taxpayer to share that risk, right? Before, it was just the private investor taking on the risk. But once, patent rights are weakened and there's all this talk about, where the government can come in and decide when to waive a patent, when not to, you're inherently asking the government then to make the decision on, which patent rights should be waived and, which technology should be shared publicly. And that gets into some really perverse incentives on getting the private investor to share or not to share risk with the taxpayer. And I don't think that these kinds of things have been thought out thoroughly by people in Washington or Geneva who are having these conversations.
Thanks. Eric, thoughts on consequences?
Yeah, thanks so much. Great question. So I think that one of the misunderstandings about a waiver is some people hear waiver and they think all countries need to waive IP rights as a result of the WTO passing a waiver. That, of course, is not true. It gives the option. It provides the option of doing these things, of lowering IP protection without being in violation of WTO rules. So I think what is happening now is I think industry is watching how governments, WTO members, are reacting to the existing waiver. And for those governments that end up, taking advantage of the waiver or taking, even going further than what the waiver permits, I think there'll be consequences in terms of, the industry's understanding of how seriously those particular governments take IP rights and IP protection, and that will have consequences in terms of investment and in terms of the willingness to voluntarily license and collaborate. So I think that's going to be that's definitely one of the results. And the other possibility that I'm really concerned about is, to the extent possible, I question whether this type of waiver will make companies think twice when they have the option, when they're making the decision of whether to protect their IP through a patent or through a trade secret. So the advantage of having a patent for the world is that it's all public. You explain, in order to get the patent, you have to disclose what the patented invention is, and you have to disclose it in a way that it can be, that the invention can be made by a person of ordinary skill in the art. The trade secret, and then after the period of time that the patent runs, it's open to the public. It becomes open to the public domain for everybody to use without any license fees or any threat of infringement. A trade secret can go on forever, and it's not disclosed to the public. And we saw that, it's, as I think I discussed in my opening statement, the ability to, even if a country decides to compulsory license or a trade secret or allow others to not protect trade secrets, it's not clear in practice how that is even possible. A patent, though, it's open to the public. Everybody can read it and understand it. That's the idea. And so it becomes much riskier to have a patent than to have a trade secret. You can't always make that choice because certain things can be reverse engineered. So there's certain types of technology where a patent is really the only choice. But in those instances where industry has a choice, I'm concerned that trade secrets will become more attractive. So.
And that of course, it reduces the probability of technology diffusion.
Right.
Yes. So, I think, we're getting to the point where we can take some audience questions, and I believe we have one at least. And okay, and then Josh. Yeah. So, can you step up to the microphone, please?
Rather speak loudly.
Yeah, but we actually can't hear you that well up here.
Okay. So thank you for this panel, and as Ernest knows, I've been on some trips to Geneva in the last few years, and really more just a comment. I would just encourage everybody to support the effort to get the IP enforcement coordinator confirmed and in the White House, because from what I see, having worked on a variety of issues and campaigns in and out of IP over the years, this, as much as anything I've seen, is going to be successful going forward as a communications and as a policy and political effort more than as a legal effort, because I think, particularly in Geneva, the messaging, often based on inaccuracies, has been persuasive in that setting. And so I would just encourage folks here to be supportive of kind of broader efforts, including, as I said, the IP enforcement coordinator. Hopefully that will prove a helpful voice within the White House, which we've had nobody within the White House really to speak up for IP specifically in the last few years. I think that contributed to this. And I just think it's great to talk about how this should have played out and what the, how everything's written, but it's at our detriment if we don't sort of support a lot of efforts, which people in this room are engaged in and in different ways. I just think that's the way we're going to prevail. And then the last thing I'll say is even the more limited waiver that was approved, again, having worked on a variety of issues, I said before it happened and then after, that's an empowering event for those pushing to weaken IP. So I think I just sort of look at this as much more macro, and for people who are able to engage in these kind of broader efforts or support them, I think that's how we're going to probably, and again, some new efforts have been cropping up in that lane, which is great, to educate people around the world that IP is incredibly beneficial to economy, to stability, to healthcare, to information sharing, and we need to be doing that on a very high level, both about IP in general, and as AI joins us as well, I say trustworthy AI. We got to have that message out there. So.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. So somebody here to ask the tough questions, so I don't have to. Josh Sarnoff, let's hear from you.
So it would be nice to actually talk about the reality of the damage to the innovation ecosystem. Pfizer and Moderna both produce their vaccines by, at least currently it's allegedly, I think there's little doubt, infringing a number of other patent rights which weren't enjoined. So at the end of the day, since they also weren't selling things like lipid nanoparticles on the open market, means that they'll pay a compulsory license if they're found to be liable. Similarly, they may have been willing to go ahead precisely because the government under 1498 authorized them to produce, taking on the liability. So it's the taxpayers who are paying compulsory license. No one is complaining that Pfizer and Moderna are damaging our ecosystem. It was great that they moved ahead and violated those patent rights and we got the vaccines early. There's no need for a waiver. All you need to do is infringe the patents. It's also not about the patents, it's all about the trade secrets. Back to Eric's point, it's hard to actually compel trade secret transfers. That's something that the governments where the trade secrets exist can do. So let's talk about the reality of the actual economics here.
Thoughts?
Yeah, I'll take a stab. I think generally, and I won't go into detail on the Pfizer, BioNTech, or Moderna products, but I think ultimately what the system needs to do is to encourage voluntary and quick response to ultimately problems. In this case, we're talking about the pandemic. But when you start kind of entertaining these types of drastic proposals, whether it's the original proposal or where we find ourselves in, I do think that not only causes a lot of uncertainty and chaos in just that discussion, but then in reality, what we're seeing, there are numbers of experiences where innovators have licensed their products to foreign manufacturers for COVID treatments, for instance, all to find that same product, and this is the unique, I guess, nature or the different nature of a treatment versus a vaccine, that they're useful for other indications, right? So a product that was originally developed for rheumatoid arthritis was found effective for COVID, and then that licensee, under a voluntary arrangement, we're not even getting into compulsory territory, that product started seeing itself being penetrated in markets for rheumatoid arthritis. It was not for COVID-19. So ultimately, kind of bringing it back to the waiver discussion, I think it risks a net chilling effect on the investment and the willingness not only to get into those underlying innovations, but then you think twice about even the voluntary kind of arrangements around that, right? So overall, again, going back to some of the earlier comments, I think all this does is to really gum up and prolong the response rate. But welcome other thoughts from the panel too.
Add anything, or?
I don't have anything to add to
Okay. Tom?
I'm a former lawyer, so it's hard for me to just make stuff up and throw that out as an argument, but I guess in the policy space, we can all just throw it out and see what sticks. I don't know who's that is in the code space. I haven't heard you guys speak to recent documents we've seen from some of the African countries talking about that this is really a domestic industrial policy. They're trying to build industries not to address a current health crisis, which I think is what really is the purpose of TRIPS, but to just build up their industries and create jobs and create exports. And maybe some of you could, if I missed that, dive a little deeper.
I mean, I can take a stab at that quick first. Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and yes, all that is great. USTR, this administration, the last few administrations have worked very hard with African countries to, to join the trade facilitation agreement and to strengthen their logistics regime. And some countries have been able to do that. Some countries have not. I mean, I'm just looking right here at the share of these populations across a lot of those countries you mentioned, in terms of fully vaxxed, and it varies from 2.6% in the Republic of Congo, fully vaccinated, to 87% in Cambodia, 23% in Benin. So and most of these, when you dig down into the reasoning, it's mostly, aside from lack of trust in the health system, the refrigeration, logistics issues, right? So, but yeah, no, look, that's great. I mean, but that has nothing to do with harm to these countries caused by these TRIPS intellectual property rights, right? So, and that's exactly, from an economist's perspective, and I don't know what it's like as a lawyer, but that's exactly the problem. From an economist's perspective, you drill down to why, what the real reasoning is behind this waiver, and you get things like that. It's nothing to do with the IP protections, right? Kenya, I mean, the Kenyan president, his first month in office, one thing he wanted to do was exactly that, build up his country's innovation system. He was focused on innovative agriculture and biotechnology, him being a plant geneticist himself. And so one of the first things he did in office was to lift the import ban on genetically engineered goods, right? He wanted, and the farmers were so excited about this, going through a huge drought. They needed to be able to import the seeds that would withstand these long droughts they were getting. Guess what? 2 weeks later, his government was sued by a Western-funded, non-governmental organization, right? So, so these are the problems that these African countries are really up against, right? It has nothing to do with TRIPS IP protections on COVID or whatever. So, but these are all good issues, but then we need to really think about, what is the root cause of them. So yeah, so thank you for that.
Thanks. I happen to know a little bit about this one, and I think it's frustrating because a lot of African companies are getting into this game, but not from a top-down strategy where they start with the most sophisticated technology. It's more of a backwards integration process, for example, where companies like Biovac in South Africa are doing fill and finish. There's a Kenyan manufacturer doing that. Fill and finish is the last step where the vaccine is bottled. But it's challenging for them. Biovac took about 5 years to get its first partnership because there are challenges to the South African investment environment that go beyond anything that has to do with whether a company sees a market there. There are concerns about currency controls. There are concerns about the stability of the IP environment. And so, I think there are opportunities here. A number of African manufacturers see them, and on the ground, they seem to be more focused on the practical opportunities to build partnerships. They're more likely to get partnerships when their countries are seen as a trustworthy, protector of IP rights and a place where they can, for example, get their money back if they invested in the economy rather than being, subject to currency controls. Sir.
My name is John Fraser. I'm a former president of Autumn, which is the academic tech transfer community in America. These issues are of great concern to us as well. So my question to the panel is this. Let's say the worst scenario happens and the waiver extension is approved. The White House joins hands with everyone around the globe, kumbaya, okay, we're in a better space now. Not really, but everyone thinks so. My question to the panel is, what sort of new mechanisms do you think we might have to put into place now that the IP framework has been significantly weakened? Anyone got any thoughts on that, looking ahead? I don't need secret information. I'm just looking for bright ideas about, okay, what do we do?
It's almost puzzling because we have some of these partnerships already where the manufacturers are working with the medicines patent pool and have not only licensed the right to make the therapeutics, particularly Paxlovid, for example, but have done the knowledge transfer it takes to enable those partners around the globe to make the medicines. So I'm not sure what frameworks are better than that, actually, where you're going to get that kind of voluntary transfer of know-how and teaching it takes to actually effectively produce these therapeutics. And, that's what we've seen with the vaccines, at least particularly the ones that are more innovative. There's a really great account in the Wall Street Journal in August of 2021 that described what it took for Pfizer to find partners. It wasn't like they were being choosy. They were looking hard for companies that were capable of being manufacturing partners because they had a big task. And in the case they described, it took about 7 months to working with an Italian partner, including 20,000 pages of trade secrets or confidential information, at least, shared a manufacturing team of 20 Pfizer employees on site for several months working side by side with their Italian partner. Those kind of things don't just happen from a waiver or saying, okay, now you can make it yourself without worrying about IP. It takes a partnership, and those partnerships happen when there's security and trust backed up by intellectual property rights.
Yeah, exactly what Mark said. And then I guess also like picking up what Eric was saying, I mean, with the waiver, you'll see all those equal, a decline in patent applications, an increase in the use of trade secrets, and then to really share technology or to do a real technology transfer, then it kind of gets more complicated because then it's more than just the patent. Then it's the patent, because then maybe firms will choose maybe patent only, but only a small sliver, and keep the rest as trade secrets. Or maybe to keep the whole thing as trade secrets, but then the transfer is all about the trade secret. And then you need, I guess, I don't know, a lot more lawyers.
And with that, we've got a few more minutes. Ernest, do you have some thoughts now?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think largely, how would the consequences be dealt with would be kind of innovator by innovator, case by case, but I think it's fair to kind of characterize that it will put, as Mark mentioned, at risk all of those existing licenses. I think one net consequence, an immediate one, would be firms would be wiser on how to choose those partners and where to choose those. But then likewise, it would, I think, chill this existing pipeline of COVID treatments in the immediate sense, right? This is as of mid this year, only about 3% of all the COVID treatment pipeline has been realized in terms of products available, meaning the vast majority is still in that development or research phase. And of that, entire pie, over 60% of those products are not only useful for COVID, but have either originated or have utility in other spaces, right? So it exposes, I think, those products that are dual use or multi-use in nature, right? So the behavior of, licensing or otherwise, launching those products, I think that could be affected, right? So I think that's generally what I would kind of witness in terms of trade secrets. Unlike, complicated technologies that are difficult to reverse engineer based on the final product, small molecules are largely, they're reverse engineerable, right? And one of the, WTO members that is the proponent of this waiver is very dominant in that industry, right? So there's going back to Tom's point about industrial policy, I mean, this is on full display, and I mean, even USTR has acknowledged this industrial policy in the request to the ITC's investigation by noting that the proponents that are furthering the TRIPS agreement flexibility, this is a matter of quote unquote principle for them, right? This is not a matter of necessity or is there a problem to solve, but this is a long-standing kind of ideological type of, policy that's being advanced by whether India and others at the WTO. So I know that's not necessarily a one-for-one answer, but that's I think that's some of the, areas that we should be kind of paying attention to.
One
Oh,
other. Sorry.
I think we're at the end of the day. So I'm sorry, I'll have to let Ernest have the last word, also cutting off my good friend and colleague Emily. And thank everybody. Let's thank the panel. Thank you.